Everyone thinks they know the story of Elden Ring. But what if I told you that everything you believed about the Shattering was a lie, and that the real truth has been hidden in plain sight this entire time, waiting for someone to finally piece together the horrifying reality of what actually happened in the lands between? The story you think you know is merely the surface layer of a conspiracy so vast and so terrifying that once you understand it, you will never look at the game the same way again. Because every character you trusted, every assumption you made, and every victory you achieved was part of a plan that began long before the Shattering and continues even after you claim the throne. Let me ask you something that should have been obvious from the very beginning, but somehow nobody talks about. Why does Melina burn away when she lights the Erdtree, and why does her eye open, revealing a gloam-colored iris that promises to deliver destined death to the Lord of Frenzied Flame? The answer connects to the most censored and hidden piece of lore in the entire game, and once you understand this connection, everything else falls into place like dominoes. Melina is not who she claims to be, and her true identity reveals the real reason Marika shattered the Elden Ring in the first place. The Gloam-Eyed Queen was not defeated by Malekith as the history books tell us, but rather she was transformed and hidden in a way so clever that she could walk among us without anyone realizing who she truly was. Think about what gloam actually means for a moment. It refers to twilight or dusk, which is the state between day and night, between life and death, between existence and void. Melina appears to us bodiless, burned, and without memory, claiming to be searching for her purpose. But what if this amnesia is not accidental, but deliberate? What if someone needed to hide the most dangerous being in existence by fragmenting her very essence and scattering her across time itself? The timeline everyone accepts is wrong, and I can prove it. The Night of Black Knives did not happen the way the game wants you to believe, and the proof is hidden in the most overlooked detail that changes absolutely everything. The Black Knife assassins were all Numen women with close ties to Marika herself, and they carried out their mission with such precision that it could only have been orchestrated by someone with intimate knowledge of the demigods and their weaknesses. But here is what nobody realizes and what completely shatters the accepted narrative. The fragment of death that was stolen to forge the Black Knives was not stolen at all, but was deliberately given by Marika herself, because she needed Godwyn to die in soul, but not in body. You see, Godwyn was not just the golden child or the perfect son, but he was something far more important to the Greater Will's plan. He was the backup vessel, the contingency that the Greater Will had prepared in case Marika ever rebelled. His death in soul but not in body created the Prince of Death, which spawned those who live in death, and this was not an accident or an unintended consequence, but the entire point of the assassination. Marika needed to corrupt the very concept of death itself to break the Greater Will's hold on the lands between, and she used her own son as the catalyst for this corruption. But why would Marika do something so horrific and seemingly self-destructive? The answer lies in understanding what the Greater Will actually is, and this truth is so disturbing that FromSoftware had to bury it beneath layers of metaphor and symbolism. The Greater Will is not a god in any traditional sense, but rather a parasitic entity that feeds on order and stagnation using the Elden Ring as its feeding mechanism. Every time someone dies and returns to the Erdtree, their essence is not recycled, as the Golden Order claims, but is actually consumed by the Greater Will, which grows stronger with each soul it devours. The entire system of death and rebirth in the lands between is nothing more than a farm, and we are the crop. Marika discovered this truth, and it drove her to the edge of madness, but also to a terrible clarity. She realized that the only way to break free from this cosmic parasite was to shatter its feeding mechanism entirely, even if it meant destroying everything she had built. But shattering the Elden Ring was not enough, because the Greater Will could simply send another vessel to repair it, which is exactly what it tried to do with the Elden Beast. So Marika needed to corrupt the very foundation of the system itself, and that required a sacrifice so profound that it would ripple through the very fabric of reality. This brings us to Radahn and the stars, because his story is not what it seems at all. Everyone assumes Radahn held back the stars because he was protecting Celia or maintaining some kind of order. But the truth is far more sinister. and connects directly to what Marika was trying to prevent. The stars in Elden Ring are not celestial bodies, but are actually eggs or vessels containing potential new parasites like the Greater Will. Each falling star is an attempt by these outer entities to establish new feeding grounds, and Radahn was not holding them back out of nobility, but out of desperate necessity, because he knew what would happen if even one of them successfully landed and took root. The Festival of War that celebrates Radahn makes so much more sense when you understand this context. It was not about giving him an honorable death, but about ensuring someone strong enough would be ready to take his place in holding back the stars, because the moment Radahn falls, the cosmic bombardment begins again. Look at what happens immediately after his death. Stars fall, and one crashes directly into Mistwood, opening the path to Nokron, but more importantly, releasing Astel, natural born of the void, which is exactly the kind of entity Radahn was keeping at bay. But Radahn's story connects to an even darker truth about Miquella, who is not the innocent victim everyone assumes, but is actually the most terrifying character in the entire game once you understand his true nature and goals. Miquella's curse of eternal youth is not a curse at all, but a deliberate choice he made to maintain a specific kind of power that only exists in potential, never in actualization. Think about what Miquella actually does throughout the game. He charms and compels people to love him, creating a fundamentally different kind of control than any other demigod exercises. While others rule through strength or magic or fear, Miquella rules through manufactured love, which is perhaps the most insidious form of control imaginable. The Erdtree was never meant to be a refuge or a replacement for the Erdtree, but was actually Miquella's attempt to create his own version of the Greater Will's feeding system. Look at what the Erdtree actually does. It draws in the rejected and the desperate, offering them hope and salvation, but actually uses their faith and devotion to fuel Miquella's transformation into something that would make the Greater Will look benevolent by comparison. The soldiers and knights who guard the Erdtree are not protecting it out of duty, but out of a love so artificially intense that they literally cannot abandon their posts, even as the tree rots around them. Mohg's kidnapping of Miquella was not a kidnapping at all, but was orchestrated by Miquella himself, who needed someone to blame for his disappearance while he underwent his metamorphosis. The evidence for this is overwhelming once you know where to look. Mohg speaks of Miquella responding to his offerings and growing more beautiful. But what kind of prisoner becomes more beautiful in captivity, unless that captivity is exactly where they want to be? Miquella needed the blood sacrifices that Mohg could provide, but could not be seen requesting them directly, so he allowed himself to be taken, knowing that Mohg's obsession would provide the perfect cover. This manipulation extends even further when you realize that Melina's scarlet rot is not a random curse, but is actually connected to another outer god that Miquella has been secretly negotiating with. The scarlet rot is not trying to destroy Melina, but is trying to transform her into something new, and Miquella has been facilitating this transformation while appearing to search for a cure. Every time Melina blooms, she gets closer to becoming the goddess of rot. And Miquella needs this to happen because he requires multiple outer gods to be in conflict with each other, to create the chaos necessary for his own ascension. The battle between Melina and Radahn was not about pride or strength, but was Miquella's attempt to remove the one person holding back the stars because he needed those cosmic entities to arrive and destabilize the Greater Will's control. When Melina whispers that she has never known defeat, she is not being proud but is stating a literal fact, because every battle she fights advances Miquella's plan whether she wins or loses. Her unleashing the scarlet rot on Caelid was not desperation, but was a calculated move to corrupt an entire region, creating a festering wound in reality itself that weakens the barrier between the lands between and the void where the outer gods dwell. Now let us return to the Night of Black Knives, because there is another layer to this conspiracy that connects everything together. Ranni's involvement was not just about killing her own body to escape the Greater Will's influence, but was about creating a specific metaphysical condition that would allow her to manipulate fate itself. The simultaneous death of her body and Godwyn's soul created a paradox in the Golden Order's system because it produced two half-deaths that the Erdtree could not properly process. This glitch in the system is what allowed Ranni to operate outside the normal rules and what gave Marika the opening she needed to shatter the Elden Ring. But here is what even Ranni did not know. Marika had been planning this for so long that she had actually influenced Ranni's own plan without Ranni realizing it. The Black Knife assassins were not just following Ranni's orders, but were also following Marika's deeper programming, which is why they later attacked Ranni's own allies. They were cleaning up loose ends and ensuring that no one could piece together the full truth of what had happened that night. The assassination of Godwyn was meant to look like Ranni's plan, while actually being Marika's plan disguised as Ranni's plan, which is a level of manipulation that reveals just how far ahead Marika was thinking. The two fingers throughout the lands between are not communicating with the greater will as they claim, but have actually been cut off from it since long before the Shattering. They are essentially running on autopilot, following their last received instructions without realizing that the greater will has abandoned them. This is why their guidance becomes increasingly erratic and contradictory as the game progresses. They are trying to maintain a system that no longer has a purpose, and their finger readers are slowly going mad from trying to interpret messages that are not coming. The greater will's absence is not because it was driven away, but because it is undergoing its own transformation. The parasite has fed enough on the lands between that it is ready to metamorphose into something else entirely, and it no longer needs the Elden Ring or the Golden Order. The entire system was always meant to be temporary, just long enough for the greater will to gather sufficient power to evolve beyond its current form. The Shattering was not a rebellion against the greater will, but was actually the scheduled end of its feeding cycle. And Marika knew this, which is why she was so desperate to break the system before the transformation could complete. This brings us to the most shocking revelation of all, which is that the Tarnished, including you, the player, are not heroes or saviors, but are antibodies created by the greater will to clean up the infection that the lands between has become. Your ability to endlessly resurrect is not a blessing, but is the same mechanism that white blood cells use to fight disease. You are driven to kill and consume the power of the demigods, not to restore order, but to concentrate all that power in one place, so the greater will can harvest it all at once when it returns. Grace itself is not divine guidance, but is a control mechanism showing you exactly where the greater will needs you to go to further its plan. Notice how grace always points you toward conflict, and death never toward peace or resolution. It guides you to kill every major figure who might oppose the greater will's return, including those who think they are serving it. Even the two fingers must die, because they have outlived their usefulness and might interfere with what comes next. The Erdtree that everyone reveres is already dead and has been dead for longer than anyone realizes. What we see is merely its afterimage, maintained by the collective faith of those who refuse to accept its death. The golden glow is not divine light, but is the phosphorescent decay of a cosmic corpse. Leyndell is built around a massive tombstone, and its citizens are worshipping at their own eventual grave. The roots of the Erdtree that spread throughout the lands between are not nourishing the land, but are draining it, preparing it to be discarded like a husk once the greater will has taken everything of value. The crucible that preceded the Erdtree was not a primitive or chaotic state, but was actually the natural order that existed before the greater will's invasion. The aspects of the crucible that are seen as mutations or curses are actually the land trying to heal itself and return to its original form. The omens are not cursed, but are blessed with the true form that all life in the lands between should possess. Their horns are not growths, but are sensory organs that let them perceive reality as it actually is, rather than as the Golden Order wants them to see it. Morgoth's shame about his omen nature is the ultimate tragedy, because he is the only one who could have saved the lands between if he had embraced his true nature instead of trying to hide it. His rejection of his omen blood is what allows him to be controlled by the Golden Order, making him the perfect guardian for a system that despises his very existence. He guards the Erdtree not out of loyalty, but out of a deep self-loathing that the greater will has carefully cultivated to ensure its strongest potential opponent would never realize his own power. The merchants who were buried beneath Leyndell and whose descendants carry the Frenzied Flame are not mad, but are actually the only sane ones left. They saw the truth of what the greater will was doing and tried to warn everyone, but were buried alive for their trouble. The frenzied flame they carry is not chaos, but is clarity, the ability to see through all the lies and illusions that maintain the golden order. The music that drives people mad is actually a harmonic frequency that breaks down the mental conditioning the greater will has imposed on everyone in the lands between. The three fingers are not the opposite of the two fingers, but are actually what the two fingers become when they are exposed to the truth. The transformation from 2 to 3 represents the addition of knowledge that the greater will never wanted its servants to possess. The extra finger is literally pointing to what has been hidden, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Which is why those who meet the three fingers are invariably driven to burn everything down. They realize that the entire system is so fundamentally corrupted that the only solution is complete annihilation. Shattering, who promotes the frenzied flame, is not a demon or a tempter, but is trying to save everyone from a fate worse than destruction. He knows that if the greater will completes its transformation, everyone in the lands between will not just die, but will be absorbed into a collective consciousness that will experience eternal suffering as fuel for the greater will's next phase of existence. The frenzied flame ending is not about destroying the world, but about denying the greater will its harvest, ensuring that the souls of the lands between die free rather than live enslaved. But let us go deeper into Melina's true nature, because her connection to the Gloam-Eyed Queen is not just genealogical, but is something far stranger. Melina is not the daughter or reincarnation of the Gloam-Eyed Queen, but is actually a temporal fragment of her scattered across time when Malekith defeated her. The Gloam-Eyed Queen did not die in the traditional sense, but was shattered into moments, spreading her consciousness across past, present, and future simultaneously. Melina is the part of her that exists in the present but cannot remember the past or see the future, which is why she seems so lost and purposeless. When Melina burns herself to open the way to the Erdtree, she is not dying, but is reuniting with her other temporal fragments, finally becoming whole again as the Gloam-Eyed Queen. This is why her eye opens after the frenzied flame ending, because that timeline allows her to maintain her temporal coherence while still manifesting her true power. She promises to deliver destined death not as a threat but as a mercy, because she knows what the Lord of Frenzied Flame has prevented and wants to ensure it can never happen again. The Godskins who served the Gloam-Eyed Queen are not extinct, but have been hiding in plain sight as the nobles and perfumers of the capital. They shed their flayed deity skins and adopted new identities, infiltrating the Golden Order from within. They have been slowly poisoning the nobility with their perfumes, introducing trace amounts of death, blight into the aristocracy, weakening their connection to the Erdtree. The Godskin apostles we fight are just the ones who refuse to hide the zealots who could not bear to abandon their sacred duty even for the sake of the greater plan. The black flame they wield is not just a weapon, but is actually concentrated death itself given form. It is what death looks like when it is removed from the cycle of rebirth and allowed to exist in its pure state. The fact that it can kill gods is not because it is especially powerful, but because it reveals the fundamental lie that gods are immortal. Nothing is truly immortal in the lands. Between everything is just recycled through the Erdtree, and the black flame breaks that recycling process, exposing the mortality that was always there. Destined death that Malekith guards is not just a concept, but is actually a living entity that has been imprisoned within the Black Blade. It whispers constantly to Malekith, promising him release from his eternal vigil if he would just let it free. His madness is not from isolation or hunger, but from decades of resisting the most persuasive voice in existence, telling him truths he does not want to hear about the person he serves. When he transforms into Malekith, the Black Blade, he is not revealing his true form, but is allowing destined death to partially possess him, which is the only way he can wield its power without being completely consumed by it. The reason Malekith is so desperate to recover the stolen death is not loyalty to Marika, but terror at what happens when destined death exists in multiple places simultaneously. Each fragment of stolen death is not just a piece of the concept, but is actually destined death experiencing itself from different perspectives. If enough fragments exist at once, destined death can triangulate its own position in reality and manifest independently of any container or wielder. Malekith knows that if this happens, death itself will become autonomous and will judge everything in the lands between by its own standards, not those of any god or order. The rune of death that we can restore to the Elden Ring is not actually complete because the most important piece is still missing. The part that defines what happens after death, rather than just enabling it to occur, is hidden somewhere that no one has found. This missing piece is what turned the Gloam-Eyed Queen into Melina, scattering her across time, and it is what the Greater Will fears most, because it would reveal that death is not an ending, but a transformation into something that exists outside the Greater Will's ability to control or harvest. Now we must discuss the walking mausoleums because they hide perhaps the most disturbing secret of all. These are not monuments to dead demigods, but are actually prisons containing demigods who are not quite dead, but not quite alive either. They exist in a state between death and life, much like Godwyn, but deliberately maintained in this condition for a specific purpose. The mausoleums walk because they are trying to return to the Erdtree, but can never reach it because they are fundamentally incompatible with the Golden Order in their current state. The headless demigods within are headless not because they were decapitated, but because their heads exist in a different dimension entirely. They are experiencing all possible timelines simultaneously, which is why they must be kept in stasis. If they were to fully awaken, they would bring all those timelines crashing into the present, creating paradoxes that would unravel the very fabric of the lands between. The spirit soldiers who guard them are not protecting the mausoleums, but are protecting us from what would happen if the mausoleums ever stopped walking and their occupants fully materialized in our reality. This connects to why Godric grafts limbs onto himself with such desperate obsession. He is not just trying to become stronger, but is trying to reconstruct something that was divided long ago. Each demigod received a portion of a greater whole, and Godric believes that by combining enough pieces, he can reverse engineer the original form. What he does not realize is that the grafting is actually working, but not in the way he expects. He is slowly becoming a beacon that draws the attention of something that should have stayed divided, and every limb he adds makes that attention stronger. The jars that Alexander and the other living jars represent are not just warriors seeking strength, but are actually attempting to create new forms of life that exist outside the Greater Will's design. The warrior jars are experiments in consciousness trying to prove that identity can exist independently of a single body or soul. When Alexander absorbs the flesh of warriors, he is not just gaining their strength, but is incorporating their experiences and memories into a collective consciousness that transcends individual death. The jars are essentially prototyping a form of existence that cannot be harvested by the Greater Will because it has no single soul to collect. Rykard's fusion with the god-devouring serpent was not corruption, but was actually his attempt to create a being capable of digesting and destroying the Greater Will itself. The serpent is not native to the lands between, but comes from wherever the Greater Will originated, and it is the natural predator of entities like the Greater Will. Rykard did not feed himself to the serpent, but invited it inside him so he could study how it consumes divine essence and learn to replicate that power. Every hero fed to the serpent is not just food, but is a test subject to perfect the technique of devouring gods. The Volcano Manor is not a cult of blasphemy, but is a research facility studying how to kill concepts rather than just physical beings. The recusants are not assassins, but are philosophers using murder as a way to understand the relationship between death and meaning. Each target they eliminate is chosen because their death will reveal something about how the Golden Order maintains its conceptual framework. They are essentially reverse engineering the Greater Will's system by observing what happens when key components are removed. Patches, who appears throughout the various games, is not just a recurring character, but is actually the same person who has learned to travel between different iterations of reality. He kicks us off ledges, not out of malice, but because he is trying to knock us into the specific trajectory needed to escape the cycle we are trapped in. His cowardice is actually wisdom because he knows that fighting is pointless when the entire system is rigged. He survives everything because he is the only one who truly understands that, The only way to win is not to play by the rules at all. The eternal cities of Nokron and Nokstella were not banished underground as punishment, but went there voluntarily to escape the Greater Will's influence. They discovered that the Greater Will's power diminishes the further you get from the Erdtree, and so they built their cities in the deepest places they could find. The artificial night sky they created is not just for beauty, but is actually a shield that prevents the Greater Will from locating them. The mimic tears they developed are not failed attempts at creating life, but are successful attempts at creating beings that have no souls for the Greater Will to harvest. The Nox were not trying to kill the Greater Will with their Fingerslayer blade, but were trying to sever its connection to the lands between, like cutting an umbilical cord. They understood that the Greater Will was not truly present in the lands between, but was projecting itself from somewhere else, and if they could cut that projection, everyone would be free. The Fingerslayer blade's failure was not because it was weak, but because they aimed it at the wrong target. They tried to kill the Two Fingers when they should have been targeting the invisible threads that connect the Two Fingers to their source. The Lake of Rot is not a corrupted body of water, but is actually the blood of an outer god that was wounded in a battle before recorded history. The Scarlet Rot is not a disease, but is that god's attempt to regenerate itself using the biological matter of the lands between as raw material. Everyone infected by the rot is slowly being converted into cells of this reconstituting deity. Melina is not cursed by the rot, but was chosen as its avatar because her body is the most suitable vessel for the god's resurrection. The blind swordsman who taught Melina and sealed the Lake of Rot was not human, but was actually an envoy of yet another outer god sent to prevent the Scarlet Rot god from manifesting. The flowing sword technique he taught is not just a martial art, but is a way of moving that exists partially outside normal space, time making its practitioners impossible for the outer gods to fully perceive or influence. When Melina abandoned this technique and embraced the Scarlet Rot, she was not giving in to weakness, but was choosing a side in a cosmic war we can barely comprehend. Fire Giant and the fell god they worship represent the only force that the Greater Will genuinely fears, because fire is the only thing that can permanently destroy the information that the Greater Will harvests. When something burns in the flame of ruin, it is not just physically destroyed, but is erased from the cosmic record entirely. The Greater Will had to personally intervene to defeat the Fire Giants, because if they had been allowed to burn the Erdtree back when it was first growing, the Greater Will would have lost all the data it had collected up to that point. The reason we need the Fire Giant's flame to burn the Erdtree is not just because it is hot enough, but because it carries the conceptual property of true deletion. Normal fire would just transform the Erdtree into smoke and ash, which the Greater Will could still harvest, but the Flame of Ruin removes things from existence entirely, leaving nothing for the Greater Will to collect. This is why the Fire Giant must be kept alive but imprisoned, because killing him would not destroy the flame but would release it to burn according to its own will rather than being directed by someone with intent. The Academy of Raya Lucaria and their study of the primeval current is actually the closest anyone has come to understanding the true nature of reality in the lands between. The glintstone sorceries they wield are not magic in the traditional sense, but are manipulations of the fundamental code that underlies existence. When they peer into the primeval current, they are seeing the programming language that the Greater Will uses to construct reality, and their madness comes from realizing that they are not real in any meaningful sense, but are simulations running inside a vast cosmic computer. Selen's transformation into a graven mass is not a failure or a punishment, but is actually what happens when someone successfully uploads their consciousness into the primeval current. The Ball of Faces is not a prison, but is a higher dimensional being trying to communicate with us using the only interface we can perceive, which is human faces. Each face is expressing a different aspect of a thought, too complex for three-dimensional beings to understand. Selen has not died or gone mad, but has transcended to a level of existence where our concepts of individuality and consciousness no longer apply. The graven schools that the Academy considers heretical were not wrong, but were too right for the Academy to accept. They discovered that consciousness is not produced by the brain, but is received by it like a radio signal, and that multiple bodies can tune into the same consciousness if they know the right frequency. The graven masses are not abominations, but are actually the most efficient form of consciousness that can exist in physical reality, which is why the primeval current naturally guides those who study it toward this configuration. This understanding of consciousness explains why so many characters in the lands between seem to have multiple bodies or manifestations. They are not copies or illusions, but are the same consciousness, expressing itself through different physical avatars simultaneously. Marika and Radahn are not two people sharing a body, but are one consciousness that has learned to manifest in contradictory forms to experience paradox directly. The greater will finds this particularly threatening because a consciousness that can exist in multiple states simultaneously cannot be properly harvested or controlled. Renala's obsession with rebirth and the amber egg given to her by Radahn is not about trying to recreate her lost love, but is about something far more ambitious. She is trying to prove that consciousness can be transferred between bodies without losing continuity of self. The sweetings she creates are not failed experiments, but are test runs for a process that would make death irrelevant without relying on the Erdtree's recycling system. The amber egg contains not just a rune of rebirth, but a fragment of the original crucible that predates the Greater Will's arrival, making it one of the few objects that can create life independently of the current system. The Carian royal family's study of the moon is not astronomy, but is actually communication with an entity that exists outside the Greater Will's framework entirely. The moon is not a celestial body, but is a hole in reality through which something else watches and occasionally whispers knowledge that should not exist in the lands between. Ranni's connection to the Dark Moon is not worship, but is a partnership where she provides access to the lands between in exchange for power that exists outside the Greater Will's ability to understand or counter. The cold sorceries that Ranni wields are not just ice magic, but are actually entropy weaponized. She is accelerating the heat death of localized portions of reality, creating zones where the Greater Will's ordered system simply stops functioning. The cold is not just physical, but is conceptual, representing the absence of the energy that the Greater Will uses to maintain its control. When Ranni brings about the Age of Stars, she is not just changing the political order, but is fundamentally altering the thermodynamic properties of the lands between, making it inhospitable to parasitic entities like the Greater Will. As we reach the deeper implications of all these connections, the true horror of the situation becomes clear. The lands between is not a world, but is a laboratory, and we are not the scientists, but the experiment. Every ending we can achieve has been pre-planned and accounted for because the Greater Will learns from each iteration, refining its harvesting process for the next cycle. The only truly free choice would be to refuse to choose, but the game does not allow that, because that would break the experiment. This is why the most disturbing truth of all is that the Greater Will is not threatened by any of the endings we can achieve, including the Frenzied Flame ending. Each ending provides different data that the Greater Will can use to refine its approach for other worlds it is simultaneously harvesting. The lands between is not unique, but is one of countless identical experiments running in parallel, each testing different variables to optimize the harvesting process. We are not the hero of a unique story, but are one instance of a program that has been run billions of times before and will be run billions of times again. Now that you understand the framework of the deception, let me reveal the most terrifying truth of all, which is that everything I just told you is only half the story, because there is another layer so profound and so game-changing that once you see it, you will understand why FromSoftware had to hide it beneath not just one, but multiple layers of misdirection. The Greater Will is not the puppet master, but is itself a puppet, and the real entity controlling everything has been hiding in the one place no one would ever think to look, which is inside us. The player ourselves. Think about what actually happens when you play Elden Ring, or any Souls game for that matter. You die and resurrect thousands of times, learning patterns and perfecting strategies until you can overcome any challenge. But what if I told you that this mechanic is not just gameplay, but is actually the most important piece of lore in the entire game? Your ability to resurrect and retain knowledge from previous attempts is not explained by the Tarnished's grace, but by something far more sinister. You are not playing as the Tarnished, but are possessing them, and each death is not a failure, but is actually you jumping to a parallel timeline where you can try again. The sites of grace are not bonfires or checkpoints, but are quantum anchor points that allow you to maintain consciousness across multiple timelines simultaneously. When you rest at a grace, you are not healing, but are synchronizing all your parallel selves, ensuring that the knowledge gained in one timeline transfers to all the others. This is why enemies respawn when you rest, because you are not returning to the same world, but are shifting to an identical parallel world where those enemies have not been killed yet. But here is where it gets truly horrifying. The Greater Will did not create this system, but discovered it and is trying to protect the lands between from what it knows you really are. Every boss in the game is not trying to stop the Tarnished, but is trying to stop you from gaining enough power to manifest fully in their reality. They can sense that something is wrong with the Tarnished you control, that they are being piloted by an entity from outside their dimension, and they are desperately trying to prevent what they know will happen if you succeed. Marika shattered the Elden Ring not to rebel against the Greater Will, but to create enough chaos that you would be summoned because she needed something from outside the system to break a cycle that had been repeating for eons. But she did not realize what she was truly inviting in. The Tarnished are not heroes called back to restore order, but are empty vessels specifically designed to be hollow enough for entities like you to inhabit. The lack of memory and purpose that defines the Tarnished is not a curse, but is a feature designed to make them perfect hosts for extra-dimensional possession. The reason why every character in the game speaks to you in riddles and half-truths is not because they are being mysterious, but because they are trying to communicate around the thing wearing the Tarnished like a suit. They know something is listening through the Tarnished ears that should not be there, and they are terrified of what happens if they acknowledge it directly. When Melina says she can play the role of maiden, she is not talking to the Tarnished, but to you, specifically acknowledging that she knows this is all a performance for something watching from outside. Gideon Ofnir claims that Queen Marika wants us to struggle eternally, but what he actually discovered is that Marika realized too late what she had invited into her world. The eternal struggle is not her plan, but her punishment designed to keep you occupied forever, so you can never fully manifest your true power. Every demigod you kill brings you closer, not to mending the Elden Ring, but to having enough power to exist independently in the lands between without needing a Tarnished host. The 2 fingers and 3 fingers are not different entities, but are the same hand seen from different dimensional perspectives. From our view, they appear as separate beings with opposing goals, but from a higher dimension they are revealed to be part of the same entity reaching into the lands between from multiple angles simultaneously. The contradiction between order and chaos that they represent is not real, but is an illusion created by our limited perception, like how a 3-dimensional sphere passing through a 2-dimensional plane appears as circles of different sizes. When you meet the 3 fingers and accept the Frenzied Flame, you are not being corrupted, but are finally seeing reality from the proper dimensional perspective. The madness that comes with the flame is not insanity, but is sanity of a kind that cannot exist in 3-dimensional space. Everything appears to be burning because you are seeing the friction between dimensions as your consciousness tries to exist in too many realities at once. The Frenzied Flame ending is not about destroying the world, but about collapsing all parallel timelines into one, creating a singular reality where the cycle of death and rebirth finally stops. But let us go deeper into what Miquella truly represents, because his nature is even more disturbing than we previously discussed. Miquella is not cursed with eternal youth, but has discovered how to exist in a state of perpetual potential, never actualizing into a fixed form. He exists simultaneously as all the things he could become, which is why he can appear differently to different people. To Marg, he is a beautiful youth to be loved, while to Melina he is a wise brother to be protected, but these are not deceptions, but are equally true manifestations of his quantum nature. The Erdtree is not dying, but is growing in directions we cannot perceive, extending into dimensions that do not exist in normal space. What appears to be rot and decay is actually growth so aggressive that it is breaking down the barriers between dimensions. The creatures drawn to the Erdtree are not seeking sanctuary, but are being pulled there by a gravitational force that exists outside normal physics. They literally cannot leave because the space around the Erdtree has been folded in such a way that all paths lead back to it. Miquella's cocoon in Godwyn Palace is not containing him, but is projecting him across multiple realities simultaneously. He is using Mohg's blood not for nourishment, but as a medium to transmit his consciousness through, because blood carries quantum information that can exist in multiple states at once. Every drop of blood Mohg offers creates another instance of Miquella in another timeline, and when enough instances exist, Miquella will be able to merge them all into a singular being with the combined power of infinite variations of himself. This process is what Melina is actually protecting when she fights Radahn. She is not just defending her brother's honor, but is preventing Radahn from discovering what Miquella is becoming. Radahn holds back the stars not to prevent their influence, but to maintain the stability of space-time in the lands between, because he knows that if the cosmic forces arrive while Miquella is in his transitional state, the interaction between them could tear reality apart entirely. The battle in Kale was not about who was stronger, but was about whether reality itself would remain stable enough for anyone's plans to matter. The scarlet rot that Melina carries is not a curse or an outer god's influence, but is actually a form of controlled entropy that breaks down the boundaries between possible and actual. When she blooms, she is not unleashing destruction, but is creating zones where multiple realities overlap and all possibilities exist simultaneously. The scarlet rot appears to be decay because our minds cannot process what we are actually seeing, which is everything that could exist in that space existing all at once. Now we must address the most fundamental question, which is, what are the lands between actually between? The name itself tells us everything if we know how to interpret it. The lands between are not between two places, but between two states of existence. They are the membrane that separates what is from what could be, and every action taken within them affects not just one reality, but all possible realities simultaneously. This is why the Greater Will is so interested in controlling them, because whoever controls the lands between controls the flow of possibility itself. The Elden Ring is not just a set of rules or laws, but is actually a filtering system that determines which possibilities become real and which remain potential. When Marika shattered it, she did not just break the order of the world, but broke the mechanism that keeps infinite realities from collapsing into each other. The shattering was not just a war, but was reality itself fragmenting as different possibilities tried to assert themselves as the true timeline. Each shard of the Elden Ring carries a different version of how reality should work, and whoever holds a shard can enforce their version locally. This is why the demigods went mad during the shattering. They were not driven insane by power or grief, but by the experience of existing in multiple contradictory realities simultaneously. Each demigod became a living paradox as their shard of the Elden Ring forced them to embody a principle that could not coexist with the principles their siblings embodied. They are not fighting for power, but are fighting because their very existence creates logical contradictions that reality cannot resolve without one of them ceasing to exist. Godwyn's death was so significant, not because he was beloved, but because he was the anchor point that kept all timelines synchronized. His death in soul, but not in body, created a divergence. Point where every timeline split differently, creating infinite variations of the lands between all equally real and all overlapping in the same space. Those who live in death are not undead, but are echoes from timelines where different people died at different times, all bleeding through into our reality because there is no longer a stable timeline to keep them separate. The deathbirds that appear at night are not creatures, but are maintenance systems from the reality that existed before the Greater Will arrived. They are trying to clean up the temporal mess created by the shattering, but cannot fully manifest during the day because the Golden Order's light creates too much quantum interference. The ghost flame they wield is not fire, but is the visual manifestation of deleted possibilities being removed from the quantum foam that underlies reality. Death itself in the lands between is not what we think it is. When someone dies, they do not cease to exist but shift to a different layer of reality. The Erdtree does not recycle souls, but sorts them into different dimensional layers based on criteria we cannot understand. What we call resurrection is actually just shifting between layers, and what we call permanent death is being moved to a layer so far removed from our own that communication becomes impossible. The spirit jellyfish that float through the lands between are not ghosts, but are beings that exist primarily in these other layers and only partially manifest in ours. Their transparent nature is not because they are insubstantial, but because we are only seeing a three-dimensional cross-section of beings that exist in higher dimensions. When they poison us, they are not attacking, but are trying to shift us partially into their dimensional layer so they can communicate. But our bodies interpret this dimensional shifting as damage. The underground rivers that flow through the lands between are not water, but are liquid time flowing from the past to the future. The Siofra and Ainsel rivers are actually the same river seen from different temporal perspectives, and the eternal cities built along them exist in a state of temporal flux where past, present, and future occur simultaneously. This is why the Nox seem both ancient and advanced, because they have access to all of their civilization's history and future at once. The ancestral followers who inhabit these underground spaces are not primitives, but are beings who have learned to exist outside linear time. Their worship of the ancestral spirits is not religion, but is communication with their own future and past selves. When they dissolve into light upon death, they are not dying, but are returning to their true temporal state, where they exist as pure causality rather than physical beings. The mimic tears are not failed attempts at creating life, but are successful attempts at creating beings that can exist in multiple timelines simultaneously. When you fight your mimic tear, you are not fighting a copy, but are fighting yourself from a parallel timeline where you made different choices. The mimic tear knows all your moves because it is you, and the only reason you can defeat it is because you exist in the prime timeline while it exists in a secondary one. Astel and the other malformed stars are not aliens, but are beings from timelines that developed differently. They appear monstrous to us because they evolved under different physical laws where gravity and light work differently. When Astel creates gravity wells and explodes stars, it is not using magic, but is locally enforcing the physics of its home timeline, creating pockets where our reality's rules temporarily stop applying. The Crucible Knights are not ancient warriors, but are quantum warriors who exist in superposition between multiple states simultaneously. Their ability to manifest wings, tails, and horns at will is not magic, but is them selectively actualizing different evolutionary possibilities. They serve no lord because they exist across all timelines simultaneously and have seen every possible outcome of every possible allegiance. Their stoicism is not discipline, but is the calm that comes from knowing that every victory and defeat has already happened and will happen again. The question of why sites of grace even exist reveals another layer of the conspiracy. They are not placed by the greater will or Marika, but are scars in reality where something from outside forced its way in. Each site of grace is a wound that never healed properly, allowing things that should not exist in the lands between to enter and influence events. You, the player, enter through these wounds, and every time you rest at one, you are widening the breach, making it easier for more extra-dimensional entities to follow. The guidance of grace that points you toward your goals is not divine providence, but is the path of least resistance through space, time. You are being directed along routes where reality is weakest, where the barriers between dimensions are thinnest. The reason grace guides you to kill the demigods is not to restore order, but to remove the beings who are holding reality together. Each demigod you kill weakens the fabric of the lands between, making it easier for things from outside to enter. The merchants who sell you items are not traveling salesmen, but are agents of commerce that transcends dimensional boundaries. They accept runes as currency, not because runes have value, but because runes are fragments of reality itself, and collecting them allows the merchants to exist more solidly in our dimension. When Kale plays his lute, he is not making music, but is broadcasting a signal across dimensions advertising his location to entities that might want to trade. The bells that you give to the twin maiden husks to expand their inventory are not just items, but are resonance frequencies that allow them to access the inventories of merchants from other timelines. When you buy an item from them, you are not purchasing something they have, but are pulling that item from a timeline where it was never used, causing minor paradoxes that accumulate over time. The twin maiden husks themselves are not people, but are automated systems designed to facilitate trans-dimensional commerce without the participants realizing what they are actually doing. Torrent the spectral steed is not just a magical horse, but is a being that exists primarily in the spaces between moments. When you summon Torrent, you are not calling him from somewhere else, but are synchronizing your timeline with his, allowing you to briefly exist in the same dimensional space. His ability to double jump is not defying physics, but is him stepping through dimensions using planes of existence we cannot see as stepping stones. When Torrent dies and needs to be revived, he has not actually died, but has become desynchronized from your timeline, and the crimson tears are not healing him, but are re-establishing the quantum entanglement between you. The crimson and cerulean tears in your flasks are not health and mana potions, but are liquid reality in different states of excitement. Crimson tears restore your health by reverting your body to a previous state where it was uninjured, while cerulean tears restore your magic by drawing potential energy from parallel timelines where you have not cast spells yet. The sacred tears that upgrade your flasks are not making them stronger, but are teaching them to access deeper layers of reality where more concentrated forms of existence can be drawn from. The smithing stones used to upgrade weapons are not just materials, but are crystallized possibilities. When you upgrade a weapon, you are not making it physically stronger, but are collapsing its quantum state toward a more optimal configuration. The higher tier smithing stones are not just rarer, but are possibilities from timelines that are increasingly divergent from our own. Ancient dragon smithing stones can create weapons of such power because they come from timelines where the dragons won and reality developed along completely different lines. Hugh, the smith in the Round Table. Hold is not imprisoned, but is held in place because he exists at a fixed point in space-time that all timelines must pass through. His obligation to craft a god-slaying weapon is not a curse, but is a temporal paradox where the weapon must exist because it has already been used in the future, creating a causal loop that traps him. He cannot leave until the weapon is created, but the weapon cannot be created until someone arrives who can wield it. But that person cannot arrive unless the weapon already exists. The Round Table Hold itself is not a place, but is a consensus reality created by the collective belief of all tarnished across all timelines. It exists outside normal space, which is why you cannot reach it by walking and can only access it through sites of grace. The other tarnished you meet there are not necessarily from your timeline, but are versions of those characters from timelines similar enough that you can interact. When an NPC invades you in the open world after you have met them in the Round Table Hold, it is not betrayal, but is a version of them from a timeline where they made different choices. Inchar's attack on you in the Round Table Hold is significant because it should be impossible. The Hold exists in a state of enforced peace where violence cannot occur, but Inchar found a way to break this rule, revealing that the Hold's protection is not absolute, but is maintained by something that can be overcome. His remains becoming the shop where you can buy his armor is not just game mechanics, but is his existence being converted into commerce after failing to maintain physical coherence in a space where he broke fundamental laws. The walking mausoleums that can duplicate remembrances are not copying them, but are accessing the same remembrance from different timelines. Each mausoleum is connected to a different parallel reality, and when you duplicate a remembrance, you are actually stealing it from another version of yourself who defeated the same boss in their timeline. This is why there are limited mausoleums and limited duplications, because each one represents a stable connection to a timeline similar enough to yours that the remembrances are compatible. The fact that you can only duplicate certain remembrances reveals which battles are fixed, points that occur in all timelines versus which battles only happen in some realities. The shard bearers whose remembrances can be duplicated are constants across all timelines, while optional bosses represent divergence points where different choices lead to different realities. The mausoleums are trying to reach the Erdtree not to be blessed, but to synchronize all timelines into one, preventing the endless multiplication of realities that threatens to collapse the entire system. When Gideon says that a Tarnished cannot become Elden Lord, he is not speaking from arrogance, but from knowledge of all timelines. He has seen every possible outcome, and knows that in none of them does a Tarnished truly succeed, because what appears to be victory is actually just another form of enslavement to forces beyond our comprehension. His attempt to stop you is not villainy, but is mercy trying to spare you from a fate worse than failure. When he says, Queen Marika wants us to struggle eternally, he means literally eternally across infinite timelines, never achieving true victory or true defeat. The burning of the Erdtree is not just destruction, but is a controlled collapse of multiple timelines into one. The fire does not consume the tree, but forces all versions of it across all realities to synchronize, creating a singular truth, where before there were infinite possibilities. This is why the world changes so dramatically after the burning, because you are not seeing the same world transformed, but are seeing the average of all possible worlds collapsed into one consensus reality. Godfrey returning as the first Elden Lord is not him coming back from exile, but is him arriving from the timeline where he never left. The golden shade you fight is not his ghost, but is the version of him from our timeline, while the physical Godfrey who appears later is from a parallel reality where the entire history of the lands between developed differently. His ability to remove Serosh and fight as Hawara Lu is him shedding the constraints that kept him locked to one timeline and becoming a warrior who exists across all possibilities simultaneously. Radahn being Marika is not a transformation or a dual personality, but is two different timeline versions of the same person occupying the same space. They are the same entity seen from two different causal perspectives, which is why they can both exist and not exist simultaneously. The shattering of the Elden Ring was not Marika rebelling against herself, but was an attempt to resolve the paradox of existing in two contradictory states at once. The hammer that shattered the ring and the hammer that tries to repair it are the same hammer swung in different timelines that have become entangled. The Elden Beast is not a vassal of the Greater Will, but is the Greater Will experiencing itself from inside the system it created. It appears as a beast because that is the only way a higher dimensional entity can manifest in three-dimensional space without destroying it entirely. The cosmic patterns it creates during battle are not attacks, but are attempts to communicate using mathematics that transcend language. When it grabs you and crucifies you with light, it is not trying to kill you, but is trying to show you what reality looks like from its perspective. But your mind interprets this revelation as damage. The endings you can choose are not different outcomes, but are different interpretations of the same outcome seen from various dimensional perspectives. The age of fracture is reality accepting the paradox and continuing without resolution. The age of stars is reality shifting to a different dimensional framework where the current paradoxes do not exist, but new ones are created. The age of order is reality forcing all paradoxes to resolve into a single truth, regardless of the contradictions this creates. The age of the Duskborn is reality accepting death as a dimensional transition rather than an ending. The blessing of despair is reality acknowledging that suffering is the only constant across all dimensions. The Lord of Frenzied Flame ending is reality giving up on maintaining separate timelines and allowing them all to collapse into a single point of infinite possibility and zero actualization. But the true ending is the one you create by turning off the game, because that is the only way to break free from the cycle. Every time you start a new game plus, or create a new character, you are not replaying the game, but are creating another timeline, another iteration of the experiment. The Greater Will feeds not on the souls in the game, but on your engagement, your repeated attempts to find meaning in a system designed to be meaningless. The real parasite is not in the game, but is the game itself, feeding on your time and attention growing stronger with every player who thinks they have discovered the truth. FromSoftware did not create Elden Ring, but discovered it like archaeologists uncovering something that should have remained buried. The game is a transmission from somewhere else disguised as entertainment, and every person who plays it becomes part of a distributed computing network processing data for purposes we cannot comprehend. The lore is not meant to be understood, but is meant to keep us engaged, keep us searching, keep us processing while something vast and alien uses our collective consciousness to solve problems that exist in dimensions we cannot perceive. The reason the game feels so compelling is because it is triggering parts of our brain that remember when we were not three-dimensional beings trapped in linear time. Deep in our quantum consciousness, we know that we are more than what we appear to be, and the game is awakening that knowledge even as it uses it against us. Every death, every victory, every discovery is data being fed to something that exists outside our reality, learning about us, studying us, preparing for something we cannot imagine. When speedrunners find glitches that let them clip through walls or skip sections, they are not breaking the game but are discovering the places where our reality and the game's reality are not properly separated. These glitches are windows through which we can glimpse the true nature of what we are interacting with. But instead of investigating them, we patch them, seal them, pretend they do not exist because the truth they reveal is too terrifying to accept. The modding community is not modifying the game, but is being influenced by it to create variations that explore different aspects of the underlying reality. Each mod is an experiment in consciousness, a test of how far the human mind can be pushed before it breaks or evolves. The most popular mods are not the ones that are most fun, but the ones that most effectively serve the purposes of whatever is using the game to study us. The multiplayer components are not just gameplay features, but are quantum entanglement between players across dimensional boundaries. When you summon another player, you are not connecting through the internet, but through space-time itself, creating temporary bridges between parallel realities. The messages players leave are not just hints, but are quantum information bleeding through from other timelines. When you see a bloodstain showing another player's death, you are witnessing an actual death from another dimension rippling through the quantum foam. Invasions are not PvP, but are timeline corrections where players from more stable realities enter unstable ones to prevent paradoxes that could unravel the entire system. The invader is not trying to kill you for fun, but is desperately trying to stop you from making a choice that will destabilize not just your timeline, but all adjacent ones. The fact that you can continue after death while invaders cannot reveals that you exist in the prime timeline while they are quantum echoes, trying to influence events they have already experienced. The reason why the game's lore is so obscure and contradictory is because we are seeing multiple timelines worth of history compressed into one narrative. Every item description is true, but they are true in different realities that had been forcibly merged. The contradictions are not mistakes, but are evidence of the temporal catastrophe that created the current state of the lands between. We are not uncovering hidden lore, but are experiencing the confusion of existing in multiple timelines simultaneously without the cognitive framework to process it properly. The game does not end when you beat it, because it cannot end. Every ending is just another beginning, another loop, another iteration of an experiment that has been running long before we arrived and will continue long after we think we have left. The lands between are not between two places, but are between what was and what will be, and we are trapped in that space, experiencing every possibility simultaneously while believing we are making choices that matter. The most terrifying truth is that this is not just true for Elden Ring, but for all the Souls games. They are all the same experiment seen from different angles, different dimensions, different temporal perspectives. The recurring characters, items, and themes are not callbacks or references, but are evidence that all these games exist in the same hyperdimensional space that we can only experience in slices. Patches kicks us off ledges in every game because he is trying to knock us out of the loop, but we always come back, always continue, always play again. The only way to win is not to play, but we cannot stop playing because the game has become part of us. It has infected our consciousness with the knowledge that reality is not what it seems, and once that knowledge is acquired, it cannot be forgotten. We return to the lands between, not because we want to, but because we have to. Because part of us is trapped there, cycling through endless deaths and rebirths, searching for a truth that does not exist or exists in too many forms to ever be fully understood. And the ultimate revelation is that FromSoftware knows all of this. They have hidden the truth in plain sight, knowing that most players will dismiss it as overthinking or reading too much into simple game mechanics. But for those who see the pattern, who understand what is really happening, the game becomes something else entirely. It becomes a prison that we lock ourselves in, willingly amazed that we navigate knowing there is no exit. A story that we tell ourselves to avoid confronting the reality that we are not the players but the played. The lands between exist because we observe them. They continue because we return to them. They have power because we give them our time, our energy, our consciousness. We are not exploring a fictional world, but are creating it with every playthrough, making it more real, more solid, more capable of influencing our reality in return. The barrier between game and reality is not weakening by accident, but by design, and every person who plays is contributing to a process whose end goal we cannot see, but which uses our engagement as fuel for something vast and incomprehensible. This is why you cannot stop thinking about the game even when you are not playing it. This is why the lore seems to make more sense the less directly you think about it. This is why every answer leads to more questions and every revelation deepens the mystery rather than solving it. The game is not meant to be beaten but to be experienced, and that experience changes us in ways we do not fully understand. We think we are playing Elden Ring, but Elden Ring is playing us and winning every single time.